Okay, welcome back, everyone. Next up, we have Augusta Gusty Rattling Hawk. Augusta Gusty Rattling Hawk is Oglala, Wombly, South Dakota. Their educational background is in environmental science, Native American studies from Dartmouth College, and restoration ecology. Augusta currently works for the Intertribal Buffalo Council as a technical service provider, where they assist tribes with bison through management planning, ecological practice implementation, applied traditional ecological knowledge, and partnerships. Everyone, please welcome Augusta.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you enjoyed lunch. My name is Augusta or Gusty Rattling Hawk. I am Ogallala Lakota from Wombly, South Dakota, which is located on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. I currently work for the Intertribal Buffalo Council, and although technical service provider is my title, it kind of encompasses a lot of things, right? When you work with a lot of tribes or tribal programs, sometimes you wear a lot of different hats. That's very similar to what I do at ITBC. So you all are here for forestry. You're probably wondering what the heck we're doing here talking about bison. But thank you, Jim, and the rest of the ITC council and workers who invited me to kind of come and talk with you all here about our mission and some of my current projects. But a little bit about ITBC. We're a federally chartered Indian organization. We were originally founded as a nonprofit in 1992, where we had a coalition of tribes come together from a lot of the northern Great Plains buffalo tribes who came together, who wanted to have one single mission, and that was to bring buffalo back to Indian country. And then they operated as a nonprofit for about 17 years, and then they were officially went after the federal charter status, which we have been since then. So we're headquartered in Rapid City, South Dakota, right in the Black Hills area in South Dakota. And we currently work with about 86 federally recognized tribes across the United States. So we generally work with federally recognized tribes, with about 50% of that membership being active, engaging with us, and as well as receiving technical service from our staff. A little bit of what we do is, bison's in our name. And so our mission statement is up here: restoring buffalo to Indian country to preserve historical, cultural, traditional, and spiritual relationships for future generations. And I'll kind of mention this through a lot of things, and I'm really lucky to be able to work with bison in the way that I do. So we do have our technical service staff. That's me and my counterpart, Micaiah Ruther. So with my technical service, what I do is I do a lot of the range management and ecology. I help tribes like Upstart, giving recommendations on fencing specs, management practices, watering, mineral, supplemental feeding type of things, as well as like giving advice on land management and herd management as well. And I'm kind of one of our main liaisons for Natural Resource Conservation Service and a couple of other things. So I mostly work with the land. My counterpart, she's the wildlife biologist, so she does a lot of the herd health and assists with a lot of research around like disease mitigation and trying to create better buffalo medicine, because right now it's really not as, it's pretty non-existent compared to a lot of agricultural, cattle, sheep, those types of things, where you have vaccines, you have vets who specialize in, farm animals, but with bison it's a little bit separate. We also do a lot of education. So if you go onto our website, you can find out a little bit more about what we do. But, there's a lot of misinformation out there about bison, and that's kind of like where we have to stand at the forefront to give proper information to some of our tribes, right? As well as general things like social behaviors and stuff. And this is where it's really cool to be a Native person working with bison, is because we as Native people were really shaped by the bison. And so we get to kind of make our voices known on different stewardship practices and combining it with a lot of our ecological knowledge. We do have a surplus bison program. So our federal charter allows us to have these like really great partnerships where we do have this surplus bison program where we can take extra individual animals from places like the national parks and zoos and the Nature Conservancy and give them back to tribes. So I think, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head now that I am standing up here, you know how it is, you forget. But on an average year, we're, giving back about, a minimum of 1,500 animals from these places back to the tribes. We also have, with bison comes the food sovereignty. We had bison meal here. We actually work with Menominee Nation here with their bison program. So food sovereignty and economic development's also in our name. This also relates back to many buffalo people, like bison were our economy back in the day. Disease mitigation, we enroll a lot of tribes in with different kind of disease programs, especially with the USDA APHIS, to kind of keep track of things like parasite, Johne's disease, Mycoplasma bovis, and we do a lot of partnerships and policy work, and this is kind of where I come in. Went over some of our surplus, but we also have a herd development program. We do get money from BIA, which, we're all kind of in the same boat here with the different budgets and the cutting of budgets, and we're all in the same boat, so we're all facing a lot of the same problems. But we do have this herd development, and when you get grant money, a lot of time federal grant money doesn't pay for equipment and different things like that. So with herd development, tribes can apply and it supplements their, operational costs. So they can use it for things like ear tags or supplemental hay to buy a tractor. Although it's not much, it still like chips away at some of that, operational costs that you have. So we have a herd development every year. It ended in March. I think we gave out like 46 grants, and each one of those can total anywhere from a minimum of $30,000 to up to 80. We do have a partnership with Yellowstone National Park. We have a mobile harvesting unit. Menominee has one here where we can kind of take it out into the field and harvest buffalo in the field. And this is where I kind of come in again with being a liaison for NRCS. So we do have an Advancing Markets for Producers, and more recently an RCPP program, or Regional Conservation Partnership Program. So why buffalo? I just kind of want to go over a little bit about why buffalo are important to a lot of our landscapes. It's a little bit different here, like in the forest, but a lot of times we associate buffalo and grasslands. Buffalo can go anywhere. This was historically their range, wherever native people were, buffalo were. So buffalo are a keystone species. And with keystone species, this is where the Western knowledge and native knowledge kind of comes together, while keystone species is like, okay, other species depend on them. But also, with as a native person, being Lakota, we acknowledge that we are also a part of that, ecosystem that benefits from having bison there. So bison are very culturally important to a lot of native people. And we, like often growing up, we heard that we base our communities, we base our social structure and how we govern ourselves based on how buffalo do it as well. So buffalo are very matriarchal. So a lot of times our economies and cultural and our social structure would model ourselves after that. But just like with a lot of things, native people, buffalo were suppressed and almost taken away from us. But this year, the 250th anniversary, right, has been coinciding with bison as the national mammal. It's like 10 years or so. So there's been a lot of things coming up on acknowledging bison and how awesome they are and the importance and the historical conservation of the species. And, a lot of non-natives get credited with saving the bison, but I always like to acknowledge that, there was bison because our people fought so hard for them as well. It wasn't just us fighting for ourselves and for our people, it was for our lands and for the buffalo as well. So we see bison as a keystone, as a driver for community and connection. And how do we relate that to land? Our land really benefits, especially in a grassland ecosystem, benefits from having bison. And as people, we're a part of that. And while I've been kind of doing this work, I'm relatively new to the fire world, forestry, that kind of stuff, where I was invited to the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network conference in Houston, where I met Jim and Bill, and I've been able to have their ear a little bit and learning from them in such a short time. But it really made a huge, while I was in college growing up, we knew that fire was a part of our ecosystem. And then more recently, realizing that fire was also suppressed from our ecosystems as well, just like the buffalo, because of how powerful it could be. So if you want to oppress people, you oppress the land and things that they depend on. So I see fire in the same way. So a lot of my fire journey has been trying to come back to reconnect bison and fire together for overall like land benefit. So fire, in a way, affects everything, both negatively and positively, but it really can drive a lot of things, especially benefiting the buffalo. And then from there on, it creates this effect where it can benefit birds, right? Like in the grasslands, we have really special birds that nest on the ground. So, and that depend on buffalo migration, that depend on the herbivory and insects as well. We have a dung beetle back home that's an endangered species, so we have a lot of these things there. So the importance, buffalo can drive biodiversity if managed correctly. You know, there's a lot of organizations nowadays where they're really driving buffalo as a, you know, better meat source and everything like this, and I'll kind of get into some of this a little bit later. That buffalo can drive biodiversity for your grassland, especially if, you know, put out doing a lot of rotational grazing, and also with all the plants and animals that depend on them, even down to like frogs and amphibians, where a lot of people might not relate those to being as conjoined with the bison as they are, but they are. And another big part is our ecosystems are really disconnected, right? Because when the colonizers came over, especially in my country, we're allotted, right? Like it's checkerboarded everywhere. So, and then a lot of those lands were lost due to, you know, a lot of different aspects of colonization, right? And so, and the bison are kind of now in this same, you know, on like little reservations outside of where they would have been. So before, this was a like migrating animal that could just go wherever they wanted to. And now we're kind of putting them into the confines of a pasture. And this is where I really try to come in with, like, you know, you can have bison on smaller land bases, but you have to be really smart about it, right? This is where we come in as Native people to try to do better for our bison relatives, but also remembering that we're caretakers as well, and that we need to do our aspect to restore landscapes. Also, having bison and having land and our connection to that, to me, is cultural sustainability, right? We're still able to like practice our culture, have our ceremonies, eat our spiritual foods, harvest our sacred plants, our culturally significant plants, because we have bison and because we have land. And so all of these things are super interconnected. And, you know, back home in a grassland, actually a huge portion of our grasses are non-native species. And so this is where, you know, I'll talk about some of the strategies a little bit later on how we can start to integrate some of these new things. But it's a little bit challenging. You know, what I've learned about the fire world is that there really isn't a straightforward answer all the time, although it would be really nice if there was, but usually that's not the case. So with culture and current management, how does ITBC balance this, and how am I trying to integrate fire to do this? So there is disparities in current funding systems for bison, especially, right? USDA just came out with this big thing with trying to solidify the beef market and stuff. And a lot of times beef and cattle and stuff are kind of pitted against each other, right? There's a lot of that misinformation about bison spreading disease and a lot of different really negative things. But also, like I said, bison weren't originally supposed to be kept on only a couple hundred acres at a time. But this is where we can come in with better land management. And this is where we can be pushing some of our tribes to be using prescribed fire as something that can help mitigate a lot of, you know, current things that we face. And also the use of monitoring tools. So, you know, Western science isn't all bad. And a lot of times our Native communities already know what Western science is starting to get to, but we can make use of the monitoring tools, especially with tribes who are now getting buffalo back for the first time. Some of these lands haven't seen buffalo in 100 or so years, you know, and so it's like, okay, bringing them back, how is it changing? We can use those monitoring tools. But in our work, when we're seeing and working with all these different tribes, it really highlights the ongoing needs for tribal bison programs. And land management is just one of them, but it's also acquiring lands. It's also what are the discrepancies of some of the funding that you're getting? Are you getting any funding? And each tribe's a little bit different. So with contemporary management, right, we have these different funding systems. And with ITBC, here's just a couple that we work with. We work with NRCS a lot, especially since a lot of bison are considered under the ag realm nowadays, and there's this really big issue. And, they brought it up earlier where they were talking about BLM lands for grazing, right? But I don't know if any of you have heard where they're removing American prairie bison from BLM lands, revoking their grazing permits for cattle operations. So there's kind of one of the areas in which we're kind of facing a lot of adversity, especially in the ag field. And a lot of places, as Native people, we would like to continue to consider them as wildlife, to treat them as such. Because a lot of people go into this realm thinking that you can run bison just like how you can run cattle, when they are a very, very different animal, and they don't really respond well to that. So there's this complication of livestock or wildlife, and that can also be boiled down to NRCS. We also get BIA funding. We do get some programs through some restorative agriculture kind of grants, and we also get some private donations as well. So we like to call that our unrestricted funds, where we can use it for different operational costs, right? So we kind of know how some of these NRCS things go, and we do a lot of liaisoning for NRCS within our region. But the different management practices that we're kind of looking at, there's big discrepancies in fences, right? You can't just have a cattle fence sometimes. And then fencing is a huge issue. Ideally, we would like to see our buffalo roaming as they have before, but you have communities or other people who are like, the bison are all over, they're wrecking my garden, or they're on the road, and that type of stuff. So a lot of times when people ask me about fencing, it's like, well, you can keep buffalo happy inside of it, but the purpose of those big fences are usually to keep other things out, primarily cattle. And now we're kind of running up to the conservation ideal of bison. Like, what does that mean? What are we trying to get back to restore bison, their biodiversity, their genetic diversity? And so sometimes conservation doesn't really include Native people. And how do we get, for us, we're also eating these relatives. We're also, back home, coming of age ceremonies are centered around bison and bison hunting. And a lot of times conservation doesn't really allot for that. So we kind of have to balance between there. And then, right, the determination of how buffalo are categorized and the limitation of their social movement. So sometimes it's really hard when we're moving bison from some of these areas like the national parks back to the tribes, because we're relocating younger animals. So they're kids, right? And that can sometimes affect the social structure, because they have aunts and grandmas and aunties and stuff that they learn from and learn how to be buffalo. So if you're removing them from that to a new place, you can sometimes interrupt that social structure. But a lot of what we do is, how do we balance contemporary bison management with our different conservation practices, acknowledging that conservation has come a long way and it can do a little bit better, but what is required to have buffalo sometimes? You need a land base. We work with tribes a lot on that, but also tribes face a lot of socioeconomic disparities. It's the same with buffalo in this work, right? There's a lot of information and funding out there for cattle, but sometimes it's not there for bison, and that's where we really try to step in and see. But there's a lot of complications and current obstacles with this, especially when we're talking about, fire is already complex itself, so how are we going to bring it in when we're balancing all these different agencies, and these different agencies are also going through a reorganization process, and we're seeing it, and so is NRCS, right? Like, so there's a lot of cascading effects here, but just know that, like the bison, we always have to be adaptable, so we're always keeping our eye out. So whenever I came on to ITBC, I've been there for about 2 years, 7 months now. One of the big things that I was hired on was specifically to liaison and negotiate and work with NRCS. So recently, when I first met Bill and Jim at the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network, we were just notified, and I can't remember, this is probably November 2024, something like that. And we had applied for these huge regional conservation partnership programs. We had originally applied in 5 different regions because we work with tribes from all over. So we tried to categorize them in somewhat similar ecoregions. And In November, when I first went to the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network, we were notified that we were awarded. And at the time, we also didn't know what was going to happen because the new administration was coming in. And we knew that, with bison, sometimes things are not always friendly, and especially as Native people, things aren't always friendly to us as well. So I was able to lead negotiations for our big RCPP programs, and as of August 2025, with the government shutdowns and pausing the programs, pausing negotiations, we were awarded 3 of them. We successfully negotiated 3 of them, and somehow with the foresight of me and my partners and Jim and people at the Nature Conservancy, we slipped in prescribed fire in there because we were like, this is beneficial, this is what we need. So our RCPPs are alternative funding arrangements, and they're multi-state. So we do have a Northern Great Plains region, which is highlighted in the red, the Southeast, which is highlighted in the green, and the Southwest, which is highlighted in the blue. So these are, if you're a federally recognized tribes with buffalo program within these regions, you can come to us and apply for money from us to do NRCS practices, but we did kind of leave in a little bit of a caveat to open up NRCS's conservation handbook to us, although we are focusing these 5 conservation practices, which is primarily focused on prescribed grazing, prescribed fire, range planting, livestock pipeline, watering facilities, and fence. So these are kind of like the basics on what you need for buffalo. So we put them in there. Tribes are always asking for these things, but with prescribed fire, we were like, we'll see how that works out. And then there's a lot of talks about cultural fire. So with our NRCS RCPP fire programming, as someone who was there with, we're a small staff. We're about 10 full-time staff with a couple, others that are working only on grants, so they'll be gone unless we rehire them after that. But our grants total 63 million in total, but 15 million of each of those regions. So it's 21 million per region, but 15 million is actually going to go to financial assistance. And although this is a cost-sharing program, this is kind of one of the biggest grants for this type of work. But we threw in prescribed fire in there, and then I started turning around asking, well, what does prescribed fire look like for Intertribal Buffalo Council? What does prescribed fire look like for our tribes? And a lot of our tribes are already doing it, and some of them do it just to do it. Some of them work with their BIA, some of them want to do it, and some of them have no idea. So a big part of my job is I've been having to go through, teach myself about fire, learn a lot of different tribal policies, because not one tribe is the same, right? They might be somewhat similar within their regions, and with the reorganization of some of our federal entities and stuff, right, that's already complex. There's new people going in, some old people going out that we don't, that we worked with a lot, new people coming in, and now it's how do we continue to foster that partnership. But also, what does it look like to help the tribes with fire? So a lot of times, they're already doing it for percentage burned or different types of practices going in. There's already programs that have already existed to try to get tribes to burn more acreage. But how do we get tribes to do that for their buffalo? And a lot of tribal buffalo programs want fire. They're just not exactly sure how to do it. So I kind of came up with a little bit of different ways in my journey with learning about fire, my journey with trying to get red carded. But when we go and try to educate our tribes, we're really framing it as this reconnection, that these things were happening. Our ecosystems evolved with fire. Our ecosystems evolved with buffalo, and we evolved with our ecosystem as well. So what happens when we're breaking and separating these two, they can't function independently from each other, because then, it still benefits if they function independently, but I think that there would be a lot more benefit, and we'd start seeing a lot more of this if we start putting these two things together. So it's integral to our ecosystems, but it will also address a lot of historical and current suppression. But it also, help with misplaced species management. I like to use misplaced species instead of invasive species. A lot of times it's not the plant's fault that they're here. But also teaching tribes a lot about climate change. One of the big things that we were talking about here is ticks. Fire can be used to control ticks, but also our weather is not matching up to what our ancestors had before, with some variation in them. but also that overall it's habitat restoration. So I know I don't need to convince anyone in here why it's important to burn, but when we go out to tribes, or when I'm going out to tribes to ask what they need, how do we get fire to you? Why would you like to have fire, right? And it's the same thing with buffalo. Why do you want buffalo? Why do you want to work buffalo? Why do you want this? But a lot of times we kind of categorize it into some of these like smaller things, management of invasive species. On the grassland, it's a little bit different from here. We have eastern red juniper encroachment, which actually takes away from some of our grassland habitat, but also juniper encroachment populations have also increased because of the lack of bison as well. You know, they itch on them and break them off, so they never really get bigger, and then they're just kind of like a naked stalk sometimes with a few, you know, branches here and there. But also there's huge benefits to buffalo and different types of wildlife. Patch burning or mosaic burning can assist with our different types of grassland species, prairie chickens, grouse, these types, meadowlarks, which also are kind of in buffalo habitat. Also, one of the biggest things that why we can convince a lot of places why it's beneficial is for forage productivity. So we know that burned forage, or, you know, a lot of grassland plants actually have like armor on them. They grow stalks and then they never get rid of it. So it's really, you know, kind of annoying if you're a buffalo or a cow trying to graze on some of our native species. But you can kind of get rid of that and create larger grazing habitat. Parasite management, but also with that forage productivity, there's new studies coming out that cattle on pastures that are that have frequent prescribed fire actually weigh a bit more, you know, throughout their life. So you can actually, you know, if you're in the agricultural business, you can take in heavier animals in the fall or take in heavier animals to be processed. Litter removal, but also one of the biggest goals in doing this, and with my experience working with buffalo, is that they teach us how to be a community. You know, we learn so much, like, you know, these are some of the smartest animals I've ever come across. You go out there, they look at you right in your face, and they, you know, they see who you are, they suss you out, and if you're chill, they're like, okay, like, you could be here, I guess. But also why we need to reconnect our people with fire for that cultural sustainability is also the same reasons we need to be reconnecting people with bison. So all of these things I kind of see going hand in hand, that putting two of these things together, getting people back out onto the landscape, getting them to look at it from other than just an agricultural poundage benefit. You know, there's a lot more to it than just prescribed fire and acres burned. So being able to reconnect our people also with that cultural fire, to be able to do it what we were doing before, is, you know, going to be great. So these are a little bit of the strategies that I kind of came up with. I presented this to our general membership. So every year ITBC, we have an annual membership kind of like this, where we bring a lot of our tribes who are working with us to come together to learn, to present, to get updates from our organization. And so I kind of categorized it into this. This is a very, very simplified, you know, version, and I know that things are always changing, and I'm here to learn as well. But for prescribed fire, this is kind of how we have to frame it, especially with some of these federal funds, is that we want prescribed fire. Although I have seen a new informational worksheet go around with USDA under the Prescribed Fire Code 338, which NRCS uses conservation practices under a code. If that's included, then hey, we might be able to use federal dollars for cultural burning. But then the next thing, it kind of goes down to land jurisdiction. You know, we have tribes who lease land, have deeded land, or trust land. So we're kind of having to go through, like, who do we connect with who? And sometimes it is just a matter of connecting tribes internally within their BIA. We know that there can always be better communications between tribes and different organizations and partnerships, but here's the different strategies. I consider ecological and cultural thing the same thing. So those things can be grazing, land, parasite management, wildlife that tribes are interested in, because a lot of tribes, buffalo programs exist on places where there's like large amounts of hunting. So it benefits different wildlife as well. While on the other side, on the other hand, we could be asking the BIA, like, hey, like, this can assist with your fuels reduction, amount of acres burned, this type of thing, to try to leverage our programs to have more fire on our landscapes. And And we're working on it. We put out our request for proposals recently. I think it's going to close in July for tribes to kind of get started, and then hopefully we'll start getting some money on the ground here pretty soon. But overall, I know that this is a partnership meeting. None of this can be done without partners. In the buffalo work, working with buffalo, you know that they do everything with each other. Animals depend on them. It's not just one person, not one organization doing all of this work. So I really want to acknowledge Jim and Bill in here, as well as the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network, Intertribal Timber Council, the Nature Conservancy, the Cultural Fire Management Council. There's so many people that I could list on this who have been advisory people to me, to our program, and that, you know, that's how we have to balance a lot of this, is we have to bring in a lot of partners, and I try to do my best to be a good working partner to those people as well. So also acknowledging Buffalo Nation's Grasslands Alliance in the Northern Great Plains, and a lot of the tribes, you know, a lot of the tribes are already kind of working on this, but, you know, also community always goes into this work. If we're excluding community, we're really doing a disservice to ourselves. But this also making sure that we're including fire practitioners like regionally, since a lot of our work doesn't just happen in the Northern Great Plains. It happens here, it happens in the Southwest, it happens in Oklahoma, and even in New York. We have some buffalo in Northern California and everything, but also that through doing this work, it's creating more connections by reconnecting bison and fire, by reconnecting people with fire practices, and by connecting with bison. And a lot of times, you know, we're trying to move a little bit differently, because community events usually require you inviting people out to feed them and getting them included. But a lot of times this doesn't just fly when you need your red card with BIA. So we're trying to figure out how to do it with the new consolidation. And for me, one of my biggest things that I'm really trying to work through as a Section 17 tribal program, how am I going to get myself and other staff that I want to bring on to do this technical service, how am I going to get them qualified right now? So I know that there's a couple of different ways, but, you know, that's kind of one of the issues that we're really running into right now. But I think I'm kind of running up on my time, so I'll end it here. This is my contact information. Here's our website. If you guys want to learn any more about our mission, what we do, kind of what we're up to, you can go here to learn more. Also, you can register for like a member portal where we have a lot of informational webinars that we've done. But thank you. Is there time for questions, or? Yeah. Okay. Is there any questions?
I actually have one. Do you work with any of the First Nations on the Canadian side of the border? I know there's a lot of work happening up there too.
So we're working on it, right? There's kind of, it's just our federal charter, making sure that's kind of within the bounds of that. But we have worked with tribes who have made kind of their own, you know, kind of around the way to work with some of the tribes. So like Blackfeet and the Blood Nation have kind of exchanged there. And there's a whole lot of paperwork to move bison even across state lines. And then there's a lot more to move them across, you know, the medicine line up there. So, yeah, maybe in the future.
Did you say, what was the comment about them moving buffalo off of BLM land, cattle land?
So, you can look it up. It's the American Prairie. They're a nonprofit that specifically had bison on BLM lands for grazing and stuff. And more recently, they had their permits revoked. And that was because under the statutes or whatever, that those grazing lands are supposed to be used for like food purposes. And although some of those bison are going back to tribes like Rocky Boy and stuff for food programs, it's not really considered the agricultural food program. So that's kind of like a really big issue happening. And that's in Montana. And so that's kind of one of the new things that has been surfacing with this administration, especially with them trying to solidify or bolster up the cattle market and stuff. The cattle and bison market kind of intervene. And then also, You can take cows anywhere to big processing plants, other smaller processing plants. There's only a couple within the United States that focuses on only doing bison. And so sometimes it's really hard to get that USDA like accreditation on some bison meat. And so we do work with some of our tribes there on that, but I think that's kind of the Spark Notes version of that issue that's happening there in Montana.
I was curious if the Intertribal Buffalo Council is connected to any of the larger kind of Great Plains conservation efforts that are going on. There's just a lot of energy and horsepower, and a lot of that is prescribed fire. I mean, folks are putting down crazy amounts of fire in the Great Plains right now. And I haven't ever heard of an explicit connection to bison, but a lot of it's kind of private lands, conservation focused, but it seems
Yeah.
like there's the right collection of like interest and skills and funding there that could really benefit.
Definitely. And that's just kind of the challenge where it's at, right, specifically for bison and how we're doing it. And so that's why we always give our tribes, like, here's the options on how to justify it, and here's the partners that you could go to. So, like, I've done some work with the Audubon Society, the Nature Conservancy, and then we also have a new prescribed burn association up there called River Breaks that I've been able to get on a fire with them. But they're all about, like, getting rid of the eastern red cedar, or what do they call it, like the green glacier that's moving through. So doing a lot of that, we're trying to jump on board, and that's kind of where our partnerships with like Buffalo Nation's Grasslands Alliance comes in. They're Northern Great Plains specific, but also trying to include those prescribed burn associations. And we do a lot of work with the Nature Conservancy. So, they have ranches throughout, and they've kind of been really pivotal for me, especially with the firework, to, include it, and trying to use some of their model to bring that as well, to try to use that for what we do, and then actually going into active MOUs with them to try to use their assistance in bringing more prescribed fire where we can, right? And that's just the complexities of working with the tribe on trust land sometimes, is that they want the BIA, or like BIA needs to sign off on it. And there's a lot of discrepancies and challenges there. Not all places are like that, but right, so then that's usually when we turn to the Nature Conservancy. In the back.
Leech Lake Reservation is looking to do a bison restoration project, and they've talked about doing restoring woodlands bison.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've done any work with them.
Yeah, I actually just talked to him last week, so yeah, so we actually do a lot of work with some of the tribes here, and that's a really big interest, especially with the woodlands bison. There's only a couple of populations that I'm aware of to kind of bring back that, and we're usually getting those through like our partnerships with the zoos and stuff like that. So hopefully Leech Lake has some bison here pretty soon. There's a question here.
Is there any concern about some invasive species that might benefit from fire and take over?
Yeah, so some invasive species can benefit from that, and that's kind of where that timing of the fire comes in. So actually, one of the biggest issues that we have back home is with like Japanese brome, downy brome, just because they're so early, they seed out so early, they can easily take over like a pasture right away. And if you burn in the wrong time, you can actually help that plant grow. But then also not so much an invasive species. We have the prairie dog there, and it really favors, we call them little gardeners. They like to keep their area nice and short. So, but also fire doesn't carry through there. So on the grasslands, we see them as a natural fire break. But sometimes we've had cases where we do a fire next to a prairie dog town, then the prairie dog town like blows up because we created the habitat for them. And a lot of farmers and ranchers don't really like the prairie dog just because it, competition for grazing, and can kind of degrade some highly erodible lands and stuff like that. But yeah, that can be an issue, and that's why it's important to make sure that you're doing fire at the right time.
Have you connected with the National Institute of Food and Agriculture with agroforestry aspects of your program?
Maybe not so much agroforestry, but actually we're currently in development of creating like harvesting informational guidelines with that program as well. And then We actually assisted and helped kind of make a lot of the connections when the SNAP, was cut. And it was actually really interesting to see because we had a lot of bison flooding that program, especially within our region. So it was like a lot of families, when the SNAP benefits were cut and WIC benefits, that they were, getting a couple pounds of bison to help supplement their diets. But I would say not so much for the agroforestry, but we are involved with that program for different aspects of it, including our mobile harvesting trailer, trying to get tribes do reimbursement to go get that USDA certification or to take bison somewhere. But yeah, and then developing that mobile field harvesting guide, which we'll be doing some trainings on the end of the month and throughout the summer. If there's no other questions, thank you.